Assalamualaikum, everybody. Ingrid, thank you so much for all the work that you do for the community and this really important effort. And thank you for attending. Hopefully, I can succeed in communicating some of these ideas. I hope they make sense to you. So, like Ingrid said, or like Mariam said, I'm going to speak a little bit about the paper that I'm going to be presenting tomorrow. And part of this is what I want to talk about is what are the Islamic principles that require and impose upon us a duty to establish a culture of accountability. Now, we're used to the idea of accountability as a legal idea, right? And so I think most of us probably have a vague idea that in Islam, there's something known as an Islamic government that after the Prophet ﷺ dies, that the community continues in one form or another, right? And this was known as the doctrine of caliphate, and that there were rules, that there's a public order, that there's a ruler, there are judges, there are magistrates, there are all sorts of officials who are responsible to make sure that the laws of Islam, to one extent or another, are being respected. And this is manifested in different ways, primarily by teaching people. One of the, I think the sister that preceded me spoke about the importance of the work they're doing as preserving Islam for future generations by teaching people Islam. So that's obviously a very fundamental thing, right? But that's not the only manifestation, right? Part of the way we preserve Islam is by holding people accountable to Islamic standards. So that when somebody violates a standard, an Islamic standard, an Islamic principle, we hold that person accountable. Right? We say, aib or haram or something to that effect, right? Or something more if there's an actual state, there could be punishment. Right? So all kinds of communities, any kind of community that is organized around certain moral principles is going to have to have a mechanism for reproducing its values through education, and also some kind of legal mechanism for holding people accountable for breaching those norms, right? So a community, a moral community in particular, only exists to the extent that its norms are manifested, right? So if you claim to have a moral community, but nobody follows those norms, you don't really have a moral community, right? Let's just sort of accept that. And so the Muslim community is primarily a moral community. Yes, we're also a cultural community. Yes, in some ways we're an ethnic community, but all of that would disappear if we didn't have a moral core. And so we have to think about the ways to preserve this moral core. I came to the United States in 1970 as an immigrant, as a child of immigrants, and I think for many of my parents' generation, they thought of Islamic institutions more or less as a kind of way of culturalization of children, really not much more than that, right? And so they didn't really think about the role of Islamic institutions in a comprehensive way of fulfilling the obligations that Islamic law imposes upon us as a community. And I think one of the important questions that people have to think about, or they might be thinking to themselves, Professor Fadel, well, we're just a minority in the United States. How can we hold people accountable, right? Certainly that makes sense if you're living in Pakistan or Egypt or Saudi Arabia, right? But, who are we to try to hold people accountable for Muslim standards, right? Well, Islamic law talks about this. And so just because you're in a situation of necessity doesn't mean that nothing applies, right? So I think we can understand like a basic analogy. We know that if you're starving, you can eat pork. But that doesn't mean you gorge, right? If you're starving, you eat enough just to survive, right? So the jurists have a rule. They say necessity is determined by its scope. Right? So yes, we don't have power in the United States. We're not likely to have power, but that doesn't mean that that we're excused from having any systems of accountability, as I will get to. In fact, under American law, we are entitled to exercise a really wide degree of accountability if we choose to do that, right? Another very important principle in Islamic law that's relevant to this is what can be attained in substantial part is not to be jettisoned because it cannot be obtained in whole. This is called the juristic principle. ما لا يدرك كله فكله. Sometimes people say, well, if you do these things, it's not going to be 100% according to the Quran and Sunnah, and so we shouldn't sort of dirty our hands. Well, that's not really what the fuqaha say. Fuqaha say is that if you can achieve most of the things that God wants you to do, then you should do that. Right? You shouldn't do the fact that you can't get 100% to keep you from getting 80% or 70%. Right? So the point of these principles is that we are always under an obligation to manifest the principles of Islam to the extent that we reasonably are capable of doing so. Right? And I'm going to explain why, under the legal system that we live in the United States and in Canada as well, we actually have a lot of freedom to make effective Islamic ideas. And then finally, there's this question that people might be confused about is, well, do we as lay Muslims really have the authority to hold people accountable under Islam? Is that really something for us to do? Isn't it really for the ruler? If, we're not in an Islamic state, then we just can't get involved in that, right? Well, again, in Islamic law, the ruler is the people because the people make the ruler, right? And so this comes through as in this, I brought the statement from an 18th century Egyptian jurist, but you can find this all over. It's not just peculiar to him. So he says that if there is no judge, like if you live in an area where there's no judge because there's no Islamic order, the upright of the Muslim community stand in his place in that matter. Now, he's speaking specifically about the problem of divorce. So if the husband is abusing his wife and the wife needs to get a divorce, well, he has to go to a judge in Islam. She can't divorce herself. Well, she has to go to a judge. So what if she lives in a place where there's no judge? So this is what the rule is. That in that situation, the upright people in the community take over the judicial role. Right? But then he goes on and makes the final observation. It's not just limited to divorce. It's every matter for which it is impossible to appear before the just ruler. Right? So that tells you that all the residual powers to do justice, right, don't belong to the ruler. Right? The power to do justice is not the property of the ruler, it's the property of the Muslim community. And so where there is no ruler, the Muslim people have to do it themselves. Right? Okay, so that's our situation here. We have the obligation to establish institutions to vindicate the principles of Islam for the sake of our community, to hold ourselves accountable. Right? And so this is sort of the basic theory or political theory. I think that's very important for us as Muslims to understand our obligations as Muslims living in a place where we don't have political power. Now, what's our actual situation here in the United States? Right? Is there anything in American law that either helps us or hinders us in our obligations to be self-governing, right? Well, I think the United States, fortunately, as a liberal society, affords us every opportunity to create self-governing associations. Right? And that's known as basically the not-for-profit corporation. Most American institutions, as far as I know, organize themselves as not-for-profit corporations. Now, a lot of us, because we're not very legally sophisticated, we don't understand the significance of what being a not-for-profit corporation is, right? But it has important obligations under American law, which I will get to shortly. But for purposes right now of looking at it completely from an Islamic perspective, what I would say is that when we organize ourselves, create a not-for-profit corporation, for example, to own land in our name, contributions to build a mosque, to hire an imam, to hire teachers, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That not-for-profit corporation is basically acting in the capacity as of the Muslim community. It becomes the legal person representing the Muslim community, right? And now this is significant because in Islamic law, lots of obligations attached to the community, right? Both positively and negatively. So positively, like you have a duty to support the community, right? So the legitimate ruler, the reason why you have to obey the legitimate ruler is because the legitimate ruler is representing the community, right? You don't have a duty of obedience because his person is sacred, right? You have a duty to obey the ruler because the ruler is acting on behalf of the community. So if you're of the community, you're a cooperative person, you follow the rules. At the same time, the community is responsible for breaches, for things that happen in the community. It's like, for example, in classical Islamic law, if we find a dead person, like in a public market or the public mosque, right? And we don't know who the killer is. Well, who pays compensation to the deceased family? Well, we all do. The community does. Okay? So this is the same basic idea that the community, right? The community is not only exercises rights on our behalf, but is also accountable for our actions in one way or another to one another. Now, from the perspective of American law, the existence of not-for-profit corporations is very convenient because as an officer of the corporation or whatever, I can enter into contracts like utilities or construction contracts or whatever like that, and I don't have to pay for it if it goes wrong, right? It's just the assets of the community. Okay? Now, in exchange for that, U.S. law imposes obligations on the people who are responsible for the corporation, i.e. the directors. They have obligation to act in the best interest of the corporation, to use its property just for the benefit of the corporation, and to take care that its assets are not used to hurt other people. Now, in the normal course of things, if something happens, like let's say there's a car accident in the parking lot of a mosque, right? The directors aren't going to be personally liable for, but if they've been grossly negligent and allowed for the creation of, let's say, a sinkhole in the middle of the parking lot, right? And they've done nothing to fix it, well then yes, they could become personally liable, right? So, and this is American law. American law imposes on them duties to act reasonably with respect to the affairs of the corporation. Now, this is exactly what Islamic law says. Islamic law says the public officials, who we call awliya, wali, right? They have this is not a privilege, it's a duty that the person who has it owes toward the community. And if that person doesn't live up to those duties, they can be, in certain situations, personally liable for failure to live up to those, right? So there is a kind of, I would say, happy coincidence here between the general principles of Islamic law governing the duties of public officials and the obligations that American corporate law puts on directors and officers of not-for-profit corporations, right? Okay, so if we look at the specific question that the Hurma Project is sort of trying to work on, and that is the personal dignity of individuals, make sure that they're all safe and secure from sexual misconduct, etc. It's obvious that under American law, that the directors of a not-for-profit corporations and mosques are going to be potentially liable for any sexual misconduct that occurs on the property of the mosque. I mean, that's obvious, right? Secondly, it's also likely that they would be potentially liable for any kind of sexual misconduct that happens as a result of employees that they hire who then commit some sort of act of sexual misconduct in the course of their duty, right? So part of their responsibility as directors under American law for sure is to make sure that they adopt certain policies that are reasonably designed to make sure that people are not vulnerable to these kinds of assaults to their persons, right? So this can come up in something like hiring policies. So at the minimum, mosques should be doing background checks of the people that they hire. I know this sounds sort of strange, probably, to most of you here, but that's just kind of basic diligence, good governance practices that we should all learn to adopt, right? You know, we're a much bigger community than we were 50 years ago. There's no way you can just sort of take people, you know, that walk through the door and just assume you know anything about them, right? So normal businesses do background checks on employees. A fortiori, we should be doing background checks on people who we are trusting to teach our children and our community member religion, right? So that seems to be like a no-brainer. Now, one of the issues I think that comes up is because we don't distinguish very clearly between religion and policy. So a lot of us will say, well, brother, you know, you might not want to do that, but it's not, you know, are you sure it's haram? Maybe there's an argument, etc. And so you don't want to like judge somebody just because they have a difference of opinion, you know, etc. Have a certain kind of tolerance or something like that, right? That might be true before God, okay? But it might really be bad. There are lots of things that aren't haram, but are still really bad for you to do, right? It might not be haram for me to be ignorant, but it's not good for me either, right? So there are lots of things that people might do that might not count as sins on the day of judgment, but aren't good for us as a community to be engaging in. That's policy, okay? So boards of directors, their job is not simply to make sure that people aren't committing sin. Their job is to make sure that they are running the affairs of the community in a way that's good for the community, which is more than just making sure that people aren't committing the most narrow definition of sin possible. So they should also promulgate policies about termination of employment, because there could be a wide gap between some type of misconduct that is a clear sin, right? Another kind of conduct that just shows really poor judgment. That this is not the kind of person that we want to entrust with, you know, any kind of responsibility in the community, even if it's not a slam dunk sin, right? And in order to be able to do this without creating controversy, looking like a fanatic or something like that, it's important to have policies, right? And so again, I want to emphasize, particularly people here who are leaders in the community, you know, there's a certain way of doing leadership in North America, right? Having written policies is really important. Really important in order to prevent unnecessary conflict and making it clear for everybody what the expectations are, right? And that way you avoid disputes about what's haram and what's halal, which could be endless, right? You just have clear policies of what you expect and what you don't expect. Because there are lots of things that people think are not haram, and maybe they're not haram, but they're just not really good either, right? Now, I think one of the most difficult problems is how to balance accountability with other Islamic values, such as privacy, which is a very, very important Islamic value, right? And also the idea that we shouldn't be advertising people's mistakes. And these are all important. But we have to understand two different things. When the Quran tells us not to gossip and not to spy on each other and not to indulge rumors, that is something that's directed to us, our capacity as individuals. So it's very virtuous of us as individuals not to gossip, right? Not to speculate on people's mistakes, etc., right? But if you are a responsible person, if you're a responsible official, responsible for the welfare of the community, That's not the logic you apply if you hear that somebody has been assaulted, right? Because now you're talking about a potential crime, right? And a crime is affecting somebody's rights in this life. So again, the Fuqaha talked about the difference between haqqullah, something, a claim that God has, God vindicates on the day of judgment, and huquq al-ibad, the rights of human beings. We human beings are weak. We're weak, we're finite, we're mortal. Our rights can only be vindicated in this life. God is infinite, eternal, absolute. So God will vindicate his rights on the day of judgment. We need to have our rights vindicated here and now. So the Fuqaha said that when the rights of God and the rights of human beings conflict, we give priority to the rights of people, right? So we can't say that, oh, this person's been assaulted. We have to protect the honor of the assaulter, right? That's not the place for that, right? Okay. At the same time, though, we don't know if it's true. We have to also worry about the possibility that, maybe the truth is not as obvious as this person is claiming. So we need to have procedures that balance these different concerns. Remember I said at the beginning, الضرورة تقدر بقدرها, right? So necessity is determined by the extent of the necessity. So here what I suggest is that mosques adopt confidential reporting requirements or confidential reporting measures, so that if somebody in the community believes that something untoward has happened to her or him or somebody else, they can make a report confidentially to the responsible people in the community, and then they can institute a confidential investigation. Very important that this has to be confidential, because we do have to respect the privacy of everybody that's involved. Because it could be that there's an innocent explanation for what happened, right? And so we have to try to develop procedures that balance all these different concerns together. But what we can't do is, on the one hand, say, oh, it's always privacy, or oh, it's always truth, right? Because we have to harmonize, because both of these values are very, very important to us as Muslims. Privacy is very important. Truth and accountability is very important. And so we have to think of ways to adopt procedures that harmonize both. And that's the challenge facing us. Thank you.